video is a little different than our normal. It's the story of Grace. Back in 2019, we decided to add a third horse to our horse-powered farm, and we had no idea we were about to embark on a journey that would take about 2 years of rehabilitation to rescue this poor girl. In essence, we found a horse that was promised to be perfectly healthy and sound. And I drove out to, it was actually in another state, so I got there to see her, and she was nothing like what the seller had advertised. She was actually missing one shoe, and what I saw was a pitiful excuse of a draft horse. She was underweight, she was limping on the foot without a shoe, and just generally looked bad. But despite all that, he had already hitched her up and was proud to show me everything she knew in harness. After a few minutes of watching her, I asked him to stop. I had him pull the other front shoes so that she could stand more balanced. And we got him to agree to allow us to take her on a trial where I could get her a good vet check and find out just what was going on. Now you might ask, why would we have done that? Well, I did see a lot of potential. Despite the issues, it was clear she had a heart of gold and she was willing to try anything. So we thought we'd figure out what was wrong deep inside and go from there.
The next day, I gave her a good cleanup job and really got to look her over. She had a collar sore on her neck, thick mats in her mane and tail, leg mites and the resulting scabs in her feather, as well as overgrown and laminitic front hooves. You can see in this photo of her right front hoof how pinched the hoof rings look as they grew downward. You can imagine how, with each step she took, she put lever pressure on the toe in particular, causing prying forces that were literally peeling that hoof wall away from the inner tissues. In addition, you can see how the hoof wall looked weak, cracked, and flaky, suggesting significant nutritional deficiencies. The pink areas you see indicate bruising, which occurred as the hoof structures separate. The underside of the hoof offered more information. You can distinctly see the overgrown bars of the hoof and the toe sticking out almost an inch from where it should be. The area behind that is filled in with lamellar wedge. The dark patch you see indicates a callus, which the hoof produces to protect the tip of the bone inside, particularly when the sole is thin. The shoes on the back feet were nailed on crooked. The seller did not allow us to pull the hind shoes while she was on trial, so we couldn't get a good evaluation of her hind feet at that point. To increase her comfort, I trimmed back the excessive hoof flaring, although I did not have permission to do a full trim while she was on trial. Not realizing the severity of her condition, I drove her 2 times that first week to see if she was trained as the seller had promised. Due to her obvious issues, however, I put her front hooves in padded boots for protection. I also paired her with our strongest horse to minimize any pressure on those feet. The day of the vet check came, and we were shocked. Her feet weren't just neglected and suffering from severe laminitis, they were also badly foundered. To give you a better understanding, this radiograph image shows the hoof of a healthy horse who has been perfectly sound and working barefoot for several years. The red lines indicate the inner coffin bone and the outer hoof wall. Notice how they run parallel to each other. The blue lines indicate the angle the base of the coffin bone sits in relation to the ground, which is typically around 5 degrees in a healthy sound horse. Finally, notice the distance from the ground to the front tip of the coffin bone. In a horse with a healthy sole, we would ideally want this distance to be at least ½ inch, sometimes more. This second image shows our trial horse's right front hoof. The red arrows are not even close to parallel, showing the severity of her laminitic state. And the gray material in between is the lamellar wedge that has developed in place of a healthy white line. You can also see how the coffin bone is tipped up on its front edge with only a few millimeters between it and the ground. The blue arrows indicate a rotation of roughly 20 degrees, which is quite severe. Both her front hooves were rotated like this, and her hinds had signs of being moderately foundered, though we did not take radiographs of them at the time. Other things you see on this x-ray are a white bone chip that is broken loose, and an old abscess trail running between the lamellar wedge and the hoof wall to the coronet, where the abscess ruptured, probably a week or so before we found her.
Well, suffice it to say, it was truly miraculous this horse was still walking, let alone working like she was. Either she had a very high pain tolerance, or she had learned to cope as a method of survival because of the pressure she was under to work at this farm. Either way, the good news was all the vet lab work came back very good. So it seemed most of her issues were due just to neglect and poor trim jobs. So we thought we would give her a chance, albeit for a much lower price. Now, I'm sure some of you by now think we were absolutely out of our mind making a decision to keep a horse with so many known issues. But the simple fact of the matter is, farming and animal stewardship isn't always about practicality and fiscal responsibility. Sometimes it's about heart and just doing the right thing. Sean and I prayed about it, and we decided that we just had no peace sending this horse back to the person she came from. And even if we could not succeed in healing her, we were more at peace being able to bring her a humane ending if our attempts to heal her didn't work. So we decided to give it a shot and take the risk.
Finally, though, we were able to give her the care she so desperately needed. We removed the hind shoes and gave her a slightly better trim, making the bullnose appearance classic of foundered hind hooves more obvious. I opted to trim small amounts of hoof frequently to prevent any further damage to tight and already possibly sore joints. We also opted to leave the toe a bit thicker than ideal to try to protect that bone tip with the coming frozen ground in winter.
The next thing we did was tighten up her diet. The previous home had had her on literally a junk food diet of homemade mixed molasses, corn, soy, and some other grains, and way too much of it. She also had occasional corn stubble and whatever hay was available. Once she got to our farm, we put her on slow feed hay nets, free choice 24/7. And the reason we did slow feed is because the vet wanted to keep her weight down, keep her on the thin side to keep weight off of her feet while they healed. We also put her on a very good mineral supplement so that we could really set her on the path to healing. By now, other than a little impatience on occasion, which is understandable, she had really been a model patient.
By now, we had named her Grace. Over the next couple of months, Grace spent her time being groomed, pampered, and just generally loved on. Due to the obvious white line disease, abscess scars, and signs of thrush, she got regular hoof soaks. About 3 weeks into her rehab, we noticed an oily, tacky residue began coating her fur, and it was impossible to brush or groom out. Because nights were getting cold and I was hoping to avoid blanketing, I was forced to bathe her pretty often, to soften her fur so it could fluff up and offer her some insulation from the cold. Each bath resulted in a red residue pouring out of her fur and down her legs. It can only be assumed that her body was going through a detox process. After several weeks in quarantine, we began to integrate her into our small herd and allow her to spend regular time on our Paddock Paradise track system. Movement is critical to healing laminitis and founder. As long as she had boots on her feet, she seemed to enjoy herself, even frolicking a bit with the other horses during turnout. When barefoot, she would tenderly pick her way across the driveway between barn and track, finding the softest areas possible. Once the ground froze, she would often stand at the barn and wait until we put her boots on, before proceeding to the track. She learned to love her rubber boots and wore them for many hours each day. We would usually bring her back to the barn paddock for the night so we could remove her boots and let her feet breathe a bit. By December, we felt her health was improved enough to suffer the stress of deworming. She expelled a huge load of pinworms over the next few days. Her feet rapidly showed improvement as the upper hoof wall began to slowly reconnect to the corium and the old separated wall and lamellar wedge began growing out. The green line roughly indicates the front of the coffin bone. The blue line indicates the new angle of hoof wall growth as it tries to reattach to the corium. The red line shows the old hoof wall growing out and the amount of separation that was involved. This comparison shows the front hooves the week she arrived and then the updated photo about 2 months later. Notice the red circle around the abscess scar she had when she arrived and how it was beginning to grow down with the new wall growth. This scar became a huge marker to help us track her new hoof growth. It was also becoming easier to see how severe and compromised her white line area was, as indicated by the pink bruising all around her hoof walls. The red arrow in this photo points to the dark lines indicating dead or diseased tissues that would have to be reabsorbed, grow out, or abscess out at some point. We continued to see significant progress throughout the month of December in her ability to bear weight on her hooves. Until that point, I wouldn't dare risk asking her to walk barefoot on our tar and chip road, but lacking other hard, flat surfaces, I needed to see how she was landing on each of her feet. In this video, You can see she is walking surprisingly well, but if you look closely, she takes short steps and her body seems somewhat bunched up and tight. When you slow the video down, notice how each foot hits the ground almost flat-footed. Although better than a toe-first landing, my goal was to get a heel-first landing to really get the pressure off those toes and get the blood pumping properly in the hooves to maximize healing. Another indication that she was progressing was her turnout test with the other horses. When we let her out on the soft pasture ground barefoot, she voluntarily cantered short distances. This indicated her feet were progressing and were getting strong enough for increasing her barefoot turnout on track when the ground wasn't frozen solid. We continued using boots when the ground was hard in order to protect the too thin sole. Updated radiographs and a vet check in February confirmed we were making progress, but she still had a long way to go. We just continued focusing on frequent trims to help guide the new growth of the hoof and allowing her as much exercise as possible while protecting with boots when needed. All seemed to be going well until late April, when Grace showed up for her daily mineral very lame on her left front hoof. All indications pointed to an abscess. Remember what I said earlier about how dead or diseased tissues in the hoof must eventually be expelled somehow, and one of those methods is through abscessing. So, although hard to watch her in pain, I was also very hopeful that this was a sign the body was going through some serious healing changes. We monitored closely, allowed her to rest as she desired, and finally it began to rupture about 5 days later. Despite our best efforts to help, it took another 3 days to finish draining and to bring her total relief. By the time it was over, there was an abscess rupture line that wrapped around nearly 30% of her hoof. Thankfully, she quickly recovered and returned to her healing. The scar made for an ugly reminder of that week, though, and it would be months before it would completely grow out. Over the next few weeks, she developed 2 more abscesses, but they were much milder and faster. By the end of June, 8 months into her rehab, all abscessing seemed to have stopped, and I was hopeful that the clean-out process was over. Just to ensure she didn't bruise an already weakened sole, I became even more religious about her wearing her rubber boots when on track or hard surfaces. We also laid some rubber mats in rough areas of the track to add additional protection. Unfortunately, due in part to fitting her with new boots and partly because of those ugly abscess scars changing the fit, she wound up with a severe rub one day on one heel. This meant no more booting for a while. To ensure she remained protected, I began casting her hooves with padded casting material. It was more permanent than the rubber boots and had some risks, but we decided the risk to the sole without protection was greater. Around July, or 9 months into rehab, I did another hoof landing and weight-bearing test. You can see in this video how her body seems more relaxed and her stride is longer. When viewed in slow motion, you can see how most of her hooves now land distinctly heel first. Even more exciting is when I decided to try walking her across the gravel driveway and found that, although her soles are still understandably tender, she maintained her relaxed position and long stride. We had decided to allow her to spend the summer getting some limited grazing with the rest of the herd, for both her mental and physical well-being. Due to her still healing founder, however, she was required to use a grazing muzzle to limit her intake of the lush grasses in our pastures. With her improved diet of hay, high-quality minerals, and grazing, her fur and appearance began to really brighten. By August, all her abscess scars were almost grown out, and her left front sole had healed enough from the first massive abscess that it shed the old dead portion in one massive chunk. I decided it was once again time for updated radiographs. The new images suggested the hind hooves had improved to approximately 8-degree rotation, while the front angles had improved to somewhere between 12 and 15 degrees. It was clear Grace was on the right path. At that visit, the veterinarian gave approval to start riding and driving Grace, either on soft ground or with her protective boots. The vet also felt it was now safe to allow her to start gaining to a more healthy weight. I slowly added in a good low-sugar, balanced senior feed to Grace's daily supplements, as well as very short periods of free grazing on pasture. Grace just came to life over the next few weeks with those extra calories. She would freely trot and canter in the pasture, and I just wanted to rejoice the day I climbed onto her back for the first time, while she was wearing boots, of course. It took nearly a year to reach this point, but it felt like I had reached a huge milestone in Grace's healing. A year later, in October of 2020, her feet were working on their second growth cycle. The changes from the previous year were incredible. Unfortunately, despite regular treatments, her frogs had developed a bad case of deeply embedded thrush, possibly due to having to wear the padded cast for a while during summer heat. Despite the poor frogs, though, the overall hoof was in much better condition than the year prior. Her soles were beginning to change from the original convex shape to a more concave shape. The flares, bruising, and lamellar wedge was all growing out, and the upper portion of the hoof wall was looking healthier. Even the hind feet looked like they could have been from a different horse. The bullnose look was gone, and she walked quite soundly on her hinds. Comparing her before and after photos, taken 1 year apart, was cause for celebration. The abdominal pain line was gone, her mane, tail, and feather were thick and healthy, her body was more relaxed and stretched out, her legs stood squarely now, and her eyes were just full of shine and life. Grace had come a long way in just a year. In December, we were able to ease Grace into our holiday carriage work. This was a great option for her for several reasons. Realize that a horse-drawn carriage like ours, fully loaded, only requires about 40 pounds of pull. In fact, a single human can easily pull it. It is one of the lightest and easiest work vehicles a horse can be hitched to. Driving is also generally safer for a horse in a rehab situation, as it doesn't add any additional weight to their body or feet. So as long as they are on smooth, flat terrain, it is an ideal way to exercise, begin building muscle, and allowing enough work to really help increase circulation within the hooves. We also took extra precautions by always using her boots and always pairing her with a teammate to share even the light load. She did great and seemed to enjoy having a purpose. In January of 2021, we did another set of follow-up radiographs, and the result was thrilling. Her front angles had improved to as little as 10 degrees, and her hinds had reached the normal safe zone of 5 degrees. Other than still battling the deeply embedded thrush, she was doing great. She was able to come off the additional calories of the senior feed and was receiving the same basic hay and vitamin mineral supplement diet as the rest of our horses. She rarely offered a limp and seldom needed boots any longer when on track. We really only used them for training, riding, or work outside of the soft pasture, all of which she was still only doing lightly. Grace is absolutely thriving at this point. Anyone who sees her today assumes she is a perfectly normal, healthy horse. She freely walks, trots, canters, and even offers a good gallop on occasion.
Well, Grace's journey is not completely over yet, but we are clearly well on the way to having her reach her full potential. That said, we often run into people or get questions online regarding people who have horses with hoof issues. And for many years, any horse that was similar to Grace with her feet, it was basically a death sentence for the horse. Modern science is showing there may actually be hope, though, and it's not necessarily a death sentence in every case. If the proper veterinarian farrier team can be assembled to work with the owner, and the horse can get a proper balanced diet, a hoof trim designed for its particular situation, sufficient exercise and movement to encourage healing, then it may set them on a path to healing, just like Grace has shown. So we hope through this video, maybe we've offered some of you some encouragement if you find yourself in a similar situation, and we wish you the best. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed today's content.
If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. And if you have, tell a friend, hit the like button, and leave a comment. We really like those comments.
Otherwise, we'll see you back next time here at A Different Way.
Cheers.